This is the Jesus Movement Live, and we are teaching our series at Journey to Faith. Tonight we're up to lesson 85, so about a year and 2/3 worth of teaching at this point in time. The title that we have tonight is the Maccabees Fight for Jewish Independence. So we've entered into this period of time where the Greek Empire or the Hellenic Empire has fractured into four according to the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies, and we find that they are fighting against one another to control the overall empire. But as history shows us, it continues to break down. They don't manage to succeed, and we get to a point in time in the province of Judah, or Judea as it's now called, where the people have had enough. And the reason is because the Greeks, unlike those who came before them, finally forced them to abandon their worship of God, to no longer use the temple to worship God. They place a statue of Zeus Olympus in the temple. They force them to sacrifice pigs. They ban them from reading the Torah and the Tanakh. So basically they put an imprint on their life where they remove everything that they hold sacred. And so those in the community who are weak join hands and become what are known as Hellenic Jews, and those who remain with the Lord are known as traditionalist Jews, meaning that they're not going to change their ways because of the influence of the Greeks. And so we find ourselves tonight up to the descendant called Mathan, who will just pop up on the genealogy list from Jesus in Matthew. So Matthew chapter 1 verses 12 to 17 lists each of the descendants after the exile to Babylon. And here we find ourselves now, we're up to Mathan, and Mathan is in fact the great-grandfather of Jesus. So it might just sound like a strange name in the genealogy, but we're actually getting to that point where we're very close to Jesus and the knowledge of their forefathers. Mathan is marked here in the pink colour, and all of the leaders who ruled during the time of Mathan are listed over here in the independent Judea. And we've got Judas Maccabeus, Jonathan Appius, also Maccabeus, he's his brother, Simon Maccabeus, another brother, and then we've got John Hyrcanus, who's actually the son of Simon. So we move into the next generation of the family. So we start to follow now these leaders of their own people, whereas prior to this we've been looking at all of the leaders of the empires who've been controlling the Judean people. Up to this point in time, basically reflecting on where we got up to last week, this 3D map of Israel, this shaded green region here, is indicative of the area that was actually being ruled by the Maccabees at this point in time, specifically Judas Maccabeus. And so you can see the whole of Israel here. So you can see it's actually only a small region centered around Jerusalem itself. But this is the situation that they find themselves in. This is a picture of the statue of Zeus Olympus. And so Zeus Olympus is actually known in the scriptures as the god of fortresses. And so he is pictured here on this massive chair. If you look down the bottom, it shows people standing down here. So it gives you an understanding of the sheer size of here, and you can see that he's actually holding another female goddess in his hand, and I'm going to come back to that later when we get to that part of the lesson. But this is the abomination of desolation. We spoke about what abomination meant from a Hebrew point of view as the scriptures are written, and the abomination in terms of the Lord's word is talking about putting an image or an idol into the place of worship to defile God's sanctuary. And so when they did this, it became an abomination to God, and that's what it's seen as. Okay, so we're going to start. I'll just put this map up behind me. So I'm just going to start from the notes. So Mathan is born the son of Eleazar, and we find this in Matthew chapter 1 verse 15 in the small scripture and genealogy, where it says Eleazar, the father of Mathan. So early in Mathan's father's life, the Ptolemaic Empire of Egypt had lost control over the province of Syria to the Seleucid Empire, And now, when Mathan is born, Jerusalem and the sub-province of Judea is still under their rule. Demetrius Soter rules over the empire, and Jerusalem is converted into a Greek city or a polis. And does anyone remember what it was actually called? They changed the name. Is anyone aware that Jerusalem's name was actually once changed in history? So it was actually changed to the name Antioch. And so it was named in recognition of Antiochus, who was the leader of the Seleucid Empire. And so at this point in time, these people are actually living in a country which is a sub-province of the Syrian province of the Seleucid Empire, and their city, Jerusalem, is known as Antioch. So you can imagine what that does to the Jewish people. They're trying to remove their identity altogether. So when Mathan's father, Elasa, dies, he is aged 12 by my estimate, and he grew up terrorized by the threats of Antiochus IV, and many people around him are murdered. When Antiochus died to be replaced by his son, who's also known as Antiochus V, and Demetrius I, fear remained as they sent armies against him and his people to force them to live and worship in an unacceptable manner. As a descendant of the line of David, Mathan is not brought up as a Hellenic Jew, but as I mentioned earlier, a traditionalist Jew. And as a righteous believer in God, his life existed in a conflict between the Seleucid Empire and the Jews. So this is the setting that he's born into. And last week we spoke about what was called the Roman-Jewish Treaty of 161 BC. And it's not surprising that this treaty, that Judas Maccabees, the current leader of the Jewish people, and the Roman Republic agreed, and it had absolutely no impact on the Seleucid ruler who was called Demetrius I. The reason for this is because Demetrius, when he was born, was taken away by the Romans, and he was held hostage for most of his life. And so when he was able to escape and assume the throne for himself, he's not going to listen to the Romans at all. So when he hears his general Nicanor is defeated and killed with his men when they came against Judas Maccabeus, he sends a new army led by another general called Bacchides with a high priest called Alcimus. Tasked with reconquering the newly independent state of Judea, the Seleucid general quickly marches to Judea. So the Seleucid army, so this is the map that's behind me. It shows the Seleucid general coming down from north. Remember in the book of Daniel, in chapter 11, it talks about the king of the north, and the capital of the Seleucid Empire is in Antioch to the north now. And then it gets more specific and talks about the king of Syria, because the northern province is actually part of Syria. And so he marches all the way down, and the scripture tells us that he actually passes through Gilgal, and then he comes up here to Jerusalem. So he's coming down to reconquer this independence that's been formed by the Maccabees. So the Seleucid army make their way to Jerusalem. They camp opposite the city before departing to a place called Beeroth with 20,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavalry on horseback. Unknowingly, Judas and his army of just 3,000 men are nearby in a place called Elasa. And so here's Beeroth, here's Jerusalem, here's Beeroth, and here is Elasa. So there's a very short distance, probably only about 12 kilometres or so between all of these places. So Judas at this point in time, he only had 3,000 men at his command, and the men became terrified at the large numbers, and so they began to sneak off in the night. And so he ended up with only a remaining number of 800 people, but he decides that he's going to stand his ground. Okay. So heavily outnumbered, just northwest of Jerusalem, this battle ensues at this place called Elasa, and it's fought with men on both sides being wounded and killed. On this day, Judas is killed, and his remaining men run from the battlefield. So we've just lost the first son of the revolt, basically. Jonathan and Simon, the next two sons, recover their brother's body and bury him in the family tomb at a place called Modin with his father Mattathias, and the traditionalist Jews mourn him. So I have a picture of this place. This is Modin. So if you actually look along this rock that's going along here, you'll see that there's actually a whole series of oblong-shaped carvings in the stone. And so they believe this is the place where one family member after another was actually buried. So Modin, which I don't think I have in name on this map, but Modin is just approximately about here. It's not far away from where the battle itself was actually held. And so his brother is now buried with his father. So there's now two family members who've now passed on the basis of this battle against the Greeks. So after the death of Judas, there is a great famine, and an increasing number of Jews support the Hellenic general Bacchides, who empowers and sends them to search for any allies of Judas. The Jewish priest Alcimus is installed to govern Judea once again, and friends of Judas come together to choose his younger brother Jonathan to be their new military leader. Jonathan accepts, and when news reaches Bacchides, he immediately seeks to assassinate him. He doesn't want another ruler coming along and standing against him. So Jonathan decides to flee southward and passing Mathan in Bethlehem. So he's our descendant, he's living in Bethlehem. He travels to the desert of Tekoa and camped near the waters of the pool of Asphar. Now I'm going to put up a map in a moment. I'll just explain what happens, then I'll put up a map and I'll show you exactly what's going on. When they arrived there, they left again and crossed over the other side of the Jordan River because this general Bacchides learnt of where they were hiding. So forced to run, Jonathan sends his brother John ahead with a party of men to ask his Nabatean friends on the other side for a place to store the belongings they carried with them until after the battle. I'll just skim forwards here to the map and come back to these other images. So on this map here, here's Jerusalem. They have the battle over here, and then they go across to Modin to bury Judas. After they bury Judas, they come back and they escape down to this place called Tekoa and have to go past Bethlehem where Mathan is actually living. The general finds out about his whereabouts, and so they decide not to stay there, and they head back and they go across the other side of the Jordan River, and they send another brother who's also called John, and they send him because they're carrying all of their belongings with them, and so he sends them to take to the Nabateans who are down this way in order to have somewhere to store their baggage. And then what happens is they get to this place called Medeba, which I'm just going to speak about in a moment and explain what actually happens there. So he sends John, his brother, with a party of men to ask a place to store their belongings. But when they approach Medeba, heading south on the King's Highway, John and his men are seized, robbed and killed by people called the sons of Jambri from a local tribe. Jonathan avenges his brother's death and retrieves their belongings, and before setting up camp beside the Jordan River, screened by a thicket of reeds. And so this was one of the previous pictures that I had for you. And so this is the Jordan River in a place called Bethany beyond Jordan, which is the place where Jesus was baptized. I'm actually in the middle of the river here, and there's a couple of pools here that's got barricades around so that when it's in flood, people literally can't get washed away. And so I'm literally standing in the middle of the river. It's about 7 o'clock in the morning, and I took this photo looking up the river, and the description that we're saying here about them hiding amongst the reeds around the side of the river, you can see here how dense all of the growth is around the river. So because the rivers meander, there's places where there's secluded spots they could hide, and so they hide out, and so this is exactly the sort of environment that they would have been hiding out in. And so this is down here roughly in the same location. So the Seleucid general Bacchides learns of their whereabouts again, and he arrives with a large army on the Sabbath. And they always arrive on the Sabbath when we read the scriptures. Any reason would you believe why they would arrive on the Sabbath?
Because they know that it's a rest day, and they presume that they're not going to fight.
That's right. So when we talked last week, the very first battle that they had, the Seleucid army came at them on the Sabbath, and they didn't fight back. And so 1,000 people were killed just because they wouldn't fight back. And so they quickly learnt, this is not a good idea. We need to fight back whether it's the Sabbath or not. And so there on in, it would probably be in their records of battle plans, go and attack these people on the Sabbath because they won't fight back. And so every instance after that, every battle, they come and they seek to fight them on the Sabbath. So a battle ensues, and 1,000 Seleucid soldiers are killed, and Jonathan jumps in the Jordan River with his men and swims to safety on the other side. Unable to capture or kill Jonathan and his men, the general returns to Jerusalem and sets about building fortified cities in Judea. And so I've got a list here, but conveniently I've put these all on the map so you can actually see. So each of these blue circles here, with the little fortress symbol beside them, are all the places that the Seleucid general builds fortresses. So in other words, he's come to completely dominate this particular region. And you remember the colour that I had on the map, in the green where the Maccabees have been running, he's basically put this to cover over that whole area to take back control and put garrisons in. So a garrison is a place where they hold soldiers in order to go out and to fight. And so they put all of these garrisons in there, and they're prepared to take control of the country back from the Maccabees. He also takes the sons of various Jewish leaders and keeps them as hostages for surety. So this is their plan. So the inner wall of the Temple of Jerusalem serves three purposes. We've just moved on to a new portion of the information of what's happening because of some of the events that take place. So it said the inner wall of the Temple of Jerusalem serves three purposes. So I'm going to ask you the question, what do you think the inner wall does in the Temple of Jerusalem? And probably first before that, what is the inner wall of the Temple of Jerusalem? We have talked about this in the past. Anyone familiar with what the inner wall is?
Protection.
It's for protection. From what? From whom?
The bad people.
The outsiders. Correct? That's actually one of the reasons. In the temple, we have a system which today most people would consider very sexist because it does several things. First of all, it actually separates the priests from the lay people. So there's a complete separation between the two. Secondly, it divides men from women. So the women are permitted to go into the outer court, but not allowed to go into the inner court. So the inner court is where the temple itself is located, what becomes known as the Holy of Holies. It's where the sacrifices are made. So women aren't allowed to go into those regions. And the third, of course, is what's already mentioned, is to keep the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, from entering the sacred areas of the temple. So in the past, when I've put up a drawn plan of what the temple looks like, there's a thing called a soreg. So you come in the outer gate, and then there's a fabric wall, which is as far as the Gentiles are allowed to go. And then they go through the inner wall, and they end up in this place, which is called the outer court. The outer court has the women in there, but it also has all the functional things for the temple. So the storage of wine, the storage of wood for sacrifices. It's a place where lepers gather when the priests come out to check that they're actually clean, so they're allowed to go into the temple again, and so on and so on. As you go from each level to the next in the temple, there's actually steps. So in other words, the closer you get to the temple, the closer you get to God, there's an elevation happens on each of these steps. So there's this separation. So the inner wall serves these three purposes. And the reason I mention this is because in the second month of May in 159 BC, the high priest Alcimus issues an order to pull down this wall of the inner court. Now this is found in the book of Maccabees, 1 Maccabees chapter 9, verses 54 to 57, and it reads, "Then he took down the work of the prophets and started to destroy it. At that instant, Alcimus was stricken, his mischief was thwarted. His mouth was shut up, and he became paralyzed. He could not even speak a word so as to give orders concerning his property. So Alcimus died then and there in great pain. When Bacchides, who's the general from the Seleucid Empire, saw that Alcimus had died, he returned to King Demetrius. Thus the land of Judah was peaceful for 2 years." So this is a point, again, we have mentioned it, but the high priests that are appointed at this point in time are not necessarily godly people. They are actually descendants of godly people. So Alcimus is actually a descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses. So he's from the line of priests, but he's not from a line of high priests. And so what happens is, in the past, we did cover this before, he was actually appointed, and when he's appointed, he's not just there as a high priest, he's in fact there as a governor. Okay, so he has more powers. Now, the first thing that Alcimus did when he came into power was execute 60 priests. So in other words, he stamped his authority. It wasn't about the Lord. It wasn't about serving the Lord. It was about controlling the people. And so we see here in this story that he decided when Jonathan was doing his business and opposing the Seleucid Empire, and they were unable to catch him, the general goes and fortifies all of the city, and the priest, who should be taking care of the temple, in fact pulls down the inner wall. In other words, he further desecrates the temple, because what does that mean? He now means that anybody can actually go into the sacred grounds, which means it's no longer sacred, which is part of the reason it's called an abomination of desolation. The Greeks aren't interested in separating people. They don't have a defined boundary between men and women in temples. So this is a different outlook altogether. So the governing high priest, Alcimus, as I mentioned, dies, and General Bacchides returns to the Syrian capital, Antioch. But in 157 BC, after 2 years of peace, some Hellenic supporters travel to meet the general and ask him to return on the pretense that they feel threatened by Jonathan and his men. So the general agrees and secretly sends letters to his allies in Judea and asks them to seize Jonathan and his men whilst he travels down with a large army. The secret plot was discovered, though, and in the book of Maccabees in chapter 9, verse 61, it says, "So Jonathan and his men caught about 50 of their countrymen who were the leaders of the agitation and killed them." And so what we're finding now, we're in this point in time in the journey where we've gone through a lot of history, but all of the story is now centered around the Jewish people and the Seleucid Empire and the impact that they're having on the Jewish people in Judea. And so we get a very close look. There's obviously still detail. There's armies coming and going and all the historical information, but it's no longer about what's happening away from them because they're directly affected by them. Prior to the time of the Maccabees, the Bible reveals to us and history reveals to us that the Jewish people were actually protected by God. They were able to practice and worship God as they knew it without any hindrance whatsoever, all the way from the Babylonian exile. Whereas now, with this Hellenic or Greek influence, the people around them are trying to stop them altogether. And so this is the overriding story around the detail. So when this general approaches Jerusalem, he hears that Jonathan and his brother Simon have led their men south to a city called Beth Bassi. Now, Beth Bassi is on this next map, and this is Beth Bassi here. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is all of these issues that are actually happening, the armies that are coming from the Seleucid Empire and the Maccabean army, the Jewish people, are actually passing through Bethlehem every time these conflicts arrive. So our descendant, Mathan, in the Genealogy of Jesus, he lives in Bethlehem, and so he would have watched these big armies coming and chasing their armies, and what probably would have been very concerned about what was going on. So it gives us an insight into his life. Now, experienced in guerrilla warfare, Jonathan and Simon discussed their plans and fortify a previously destroyed desert city with a natural supply of spring water. General Bacchides arrives and besieges the city for several days while he has engines of war, the scriptures tell us, being built. What are engines of war? So if you're living inside a fortified city and someone's going to bring engines of war against you, what do you think they would be building? Horses and chariots?
Catapults.
No? Catapults. Thank you. So slings, large slings that cast stones, spears. What else do you need when you fight a city? Come on, what movies have you watched? Fireballs. Right, so they build the rampart towers. So they put them on wheels, they push them up against the wall, and the soldiers are able to go up the stairs inside, protected away from the arrows, right? So that's one of the items there as well. And so these things are being built. And the other thing is they bring another one of these towers, and hidden inside the tower is a whole bunch of men with a huge piece of timber, and it's a battering ram for the gate to try and break the gate. So they'll push it up against the front. They're covered so the arrows can't get them or things can't be tipped on them. And inside they're bashing away at this gate. So this is what was happening. So whilst Jonathan and his men were hiding in this location, the engines of war, they're called, were being built. So they were trying to keep them occupied and inside while they did everything they needed to overcome them. But before they're finished, Jonathan leaves the city with a handful of his men and uses his skills in guerrilla warfare to attack the Seleucids, while Simon sets fire to the engines of war. Now, the scriptures don't define what happens in night and day, so you might think that this happened in the night, but the fact is that they realised they couldn't just stay inside and wait to be defeated. They had to go out in a small number and do something about it. So General Bacchides and his Seleucid army is crushed, and having acted on advice of those who asked him to come, he is filled with rage and kills many of them, and decides to return home to Antioch in Syria. So the people who invited him to come, I mentioned, were the Hellenic Jews. So in other words, they're people from Judea as well, but they're aligned with the Hellenic authorities. Okay, so they had people in their body of people who were working against one another. Now, we haven't come to it yet, but we're not far away. But we come to a time where we learn about the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the Bible. And so I think I've asked before, but I'm going to ask you the question, is anyone aware of the differences? We read about them in the New Testament. We don't read about them in the Old Testament. But is anyone aware of what the differences are between the Pharisees and the Sadducees?
The Sadducees are for the upper class, and they tend not to be the more about laws, about human laws.
Right.
Whereas the
Okay, well. The
Pharisees
Pharisees.
are for the law and for the general folk.
Right. So one of the distinguishing features between the Pharisees and the Sadducees is the Pharisees used the oral Torah, whereas the Sadducees didn't believe in it. So the oral Torah came into effect when there was a lack of Bibles because they were in exile. And so they would have all this knowledge that was passed down generation to generation, but they decided it was time to write it all down so they actually didn't lose it. So Jews today have an oral Torah, a written oral Torah. There's many different forms that come from different periods of time in history, but they actually have these additional writings, and this is what a lot of their dialogue with each other is actually about. Who's right, who's wrong, what version, all that sort of thing. Right? So the Sadducees said no to all that stuff, but the Sadducees are actually birthed out of the Hellenic supporters amongst the Jewish people, whereas the Pharisees are birthed out of the traditionalist Jews who don't have anything to do with the Hellenists. And we find that the Sadducees are particularly aligned with the poor, whereas the Sadducees are aligned with the wealthy because of their allegiance to the Hellenic rulers. The Hellenic rulers in history, we did touch this last week, they actually favoured the people who would actually align themselves with them. They gave them land, they gave them position, and they gave them wealth. And so we see the birth of a division in the Jewish society during this period of time. Up until this point in time, ever since Babylonian exile, the Jewish people had actually been unified as a body of people. And so we find now that they're beginning to separate the two. All this stuff is historical. It's not actually mentioned in the Bible as I'm talking. But the fact is that when we arrive in the New Testament of the Bible, we're introduced to several new concepts. We're introduced to priests that are either Sadducees or Pharisees. We're introduced to the Sanhedrin, or the Council of the Jews. And so all of these things were all birthed during this time of history. So we're going to obviously explain them as we go. And then it helps you when you get to the New Testament, to the time of Jesus, to know who they are and why they're actually persecuting Jesus. It's important for that reason. Okay. Just find my name. Okay. So Jonathan hears how frustrated these events have made the general. Why? Because the general had aligned with the Hellenic Jews. He came down, he brought an army only to be defeated. And so he's thinking, well, why did I bother coming down here only to be defeated? And so he's angry at them, and the story tells us that he killed a lot of them. So Jonathan heard about that he was frustrated because of this, and so he sends envoys to make peace and seeks freedom for his captive men. So during the course of the battle, some people got taken on either parties, and so he says, well, how about we get together and we exchange our prisoners and move forward from that point. So the general agrees to these terms, and he actually swears an oath to never wage war on Jonathan again. So this is huge, because what this means is that the Jewish people have actually gained a form of independence. He's got a general who represents the king of the Seleucid Empire, of which they're a part of, and he's saying, I'm never going to come against you again. And so you can imagine for Jonathan Maccabee and the army and the people, they would be celebrating. They would be very happy at this outcome. So they vacated Judea, and Seleucid control is broken. So Mathan, as I mentioned, who's observed the general Bacchides pursue Jonathan and his army past Bethlehem twice now, is relieved to learn he now has independence and freedom to worship God as his people choose. Could you imagine, they're just down the road from Bethlehem. Can you imagine if the Seleucids won? What would happen? They would turn around and they would blaze their way back through the territory, and they would be killing and murdering and plundering as they do. So in this we see God's hand, because obviously it's essential that Mathan survives, because he is a forefather of Jesus himself. 1 Maccabees chapter 9 verse 73 says with this, the sword was laid down in Israel. So in other words, no more fighting. So Jonathan decides to settle down in a place called Michmash to the northeast of Jerusalem to judge people and clear the land of the godless and the apostate. And so on the map here, here's that location. So here's Bethlehem, here's Jerusalem, and they're about 16 kilometres between the two. They went to this place called Beth Bassi, which is only a few kilometres further, fought this battle, and then Jonathan leaves here and he goes to this place called Michmash. Now, interestingly, what it says here is it says he went there to judge people and clear the land of the godless and the apostate. So in other words, now that the fighting was done, what's he want to do? He wants to clean up the backyard and get rid of all the people who are against him. And so this is what he sets out to do. And so in the Bible, when we look at descriptions, we hear about how this is all hill country through here. And so I'm going to show you a picture of where Michmash is. And this is what it looks like. So this is why it's called hill country. Israel is like this. You've got varying altitudes, but this is very much what it's like. You can see that this is actually called Tel Michmash, because Tel is a word that's used to describe a large mound or a hill. And so they would always build their fortifications on top of the hill. Why? Because they can see a long distance and protect themselves. So this is the place where Jonathan went to be. And yet where he is there, he is not very far away from Jerusalem in terms of distance. And this is where he settles. So this is a great picture to get a bit of a bird's eye view of what hill country looks like every time you hear it described in the Bible. And so, and it is exactly like that as we've driven through it. Okay. In the book of 1 Samuel, in chapters 13 and 14, this place is the same place that the Philistines organised their army and were attacked by Jonathan, the son of Israel's first king Saul. Okay, so there's a connection in the Bible to this location. Okay, so Jonathan and the traditionalist Jews used this period of peace to consolidate their Judean state. But if you ask why the Seleucid Empire stepped away from conflict and control of the Jewish sub-province of Judea, it is because relationships in the region are deteriorating between the Seleucid king and some of his neighbours. So in fact, the king called Attalus Philadelphus from Pergamon to his west, and Ptolemy VI with his co-ruler Cleopatra II of Egypt to the south begin to support a rival to the throne called Alexander Baelus, who claims he is the son of Antiochus IV and the first cousin of Demetrius I. So Antiochus IV is the evil king of Syria in the Bible, the one who does the abomination of desolation, kills all the Jews. Remember last week I talked about he got rebuffed at Egypt. The Roman emissary said to him, "You're not allowed to go there." He drew the circle around him and said, "Make up your mind. Are you going to go and attack these people? Because if you do and you step out of this circle, it's like a declaration of war against Rome." Remember, the Romans protected Egypt because it was their source of grain. And so this is where the entry point of the Romans in history are affected in this region, because they had large populations and they were looking for food. And so they're worried that if another empire steps in and takes over, their availability of food will be taken away from them. And so this is the heartbeat of how the Roman Republic, as it was called back then, entered onto the scene. And so every time a battle happens, what do they have to do? They have to go past Judea to get there. And so the Seleucid king had gone down. The Roman emissary had come by boat. They cut him off and said, "Make your decision now." He said, "Well, I'll go back and have a chat with my elders, thanks." And he said, "No, if you step out of the circle and don't make your mind up, then we're going to take this as war." Of course, he had no hope, did he? Because if he stepped out of the circle, he would have been killed anyway. And if he stayed in the circle, he had to agree not to go to fight. So either way, he couldn't actually win, but that was the intention. And so we find that what's happening is that this impact on this region with the Roman people became a reason for a treaty, because the Romans were actually seeking people on the eastern side of the Mediterranean to be aligned with them, not to be at war against them. Judea is right in between the Egyptians and the Seleucids, the northern king and the southern king. And so they have an ally right in between the two. Then that's good for them geographically, in order to have an ally where they can support them either way. And so the Judeans managed to achieve this alliance with them. So what's happening now is Pergamon is actually at the west, is in the east of Turkey, and so it's the great landmass of the east of Turkey. And I'll put it on a map in a moment. And of course, we've got the Egyptians to the south, and they support a rival to the Seleucid throne. He's called Alexander Baelus, and he claims that he's the son of this evil king, Antiochus IV, and the first cousin of Demetrius, who is currently ruling the Seleucid Empire. And so I'll just put up a picture behind me and help to describe this. Here's the kingdom of Pergamon. So this is today's Turkey up here. And so you can see a very large slice of Turkey. So this is Cilicia here. So a very large slice of this is actually the kingdom of Pergamon. So them and the Egyptians down the bottom want to support a new ruler to overcome their enemy at the end of the day. And so here I have these pictures using coins, as I've mentioned before, because we can actually get a snapshot of what people looked like in these times because they were minted onto coins. This is Alexander Baelus, and we'll come to this in a moment. But Alexander Balis actually marries another Cleopatra called Thea, and they're also minted on a coin together. Okay. So oddly, there is actually no truth whatsoever to this extraordinary claim by Alexander Balis, because he's actually just an ordinary citizen of Smyrna in the extreme west of Anatolia. So that's over here, right across near the Constantinople today. But he's motivated to plot against the Seleucid king because he killed his brother Timarchus when he led an uprising in another province called Media. Found as a youth by a former minister of Antiochus IV, even though the claims of Alexander are false, he gains recognition by the Roman Senate, Ptolemy VI of Egypt, and others giving credibility to his claim. So it's under this menacing threat that Demetrius I recalls his garrisons of soldiers in Judea, and this is what we find now, is every time something happens in the region, something happens for the Jews in Judea. So we just mentioned that he put all those fortresses all over Judea, but of course they're full of soldiers. And so now that they're under threat, what do? They pull all of the soldiers back out of Judea. So for the Jewish people, this is a really good thing. So he pulls them all out, apart from the location of the coastal city of Ptolemais and the southern hill country city of Beth Zur. And so Ptolemais is called Akko today. If you go here, it's a very beautiful spot. And Beth Zur is on the lower side of the hill country below Jerusalem over here. So he just maintains two locations but pulls all of the others out. So because Demetrius had his back against the wall, he takes the unusual decision to seek the loyalty of whom? Jonathan Maccabeus, by allowing him to recruit an army and reclaim any hostages still kept in the Seleucid city of Ptolemais behind me from past conflicts. Jonathan happily accepts these terms and moves from Michmash, where we've just shown you, and he goes to live in Jerusalem, where he begins to fortify the city. So the impact now for the Jews is the fortresses have been removed, the soldiers have actually gone. The leader now goes into Jerusalem to run his nation, and everybody's seeking alliances with him. So their positions change dramatically. So Alexander also seeks to shore up support with Jonathan, and so he counter-offers Demetrius with even more favourable terms. And this includes Jonathan receiving an official appointment as high priest in Jerusalem. So what that means is he's now going to be the head of government, right? And so we see the empowerment of Jonathan. Remember that the Maccabees up to now have basically been renegades. They revolted, they've been on the run, they're running a guerrilla warfare, and so they're seen as renegades. But the fact now that they're making these offers says that we're actually recognising you and your authority in your own country. So Jonathan weighs up the experience he has received at the hands of Demetrius, and in addition to the terms he's already agreed to, he now receives another letter of offer containing even more rights and privileges. But the problem is that he doesn't trust Demetrius and doesn't believe he will keep his promises. So Jonathan decides to support Alexander. So this guy, who's a nobody, who's proclaiming to be a king, is now being supported by Jonathan Maccabeus. So by so doing, Jonathan becomes the first official leader of the people under Seleucid rule, rather than the popular leader of the people. So you can see this is now an official role. He's actually in a capacity where he can actually have an effect. So at the Feast of Tabernacles in 153 BC, he officiates and wears the garments of the office of high priest. With this new authority, the Hellenic Jews can no longer attack him with harsh consequences. So let's read what the Jewish historian Josephus says in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, in a letter sent to Jonathan by Alexander. And it reads, King Alexander to his brother Jonathan sendeth greeting. We have long ago heard of thy courage. So we're in the these, thys, and sendeths, and thy fidelity, and for that reason have sent to thee to make with thee a league of friendship and mutual assistance. We therefore do ordain thee this day the high priest of the Jews. Now there's obviously a problem with this because there's only one person who can ordain the high priest, and that of course is God. And yet these people are actually ordaining high priests. So they're actually ordaining somebody not in an ecclesiastical sense, but in the sense of a governor of the world. And so they go ahead with this. So we therefore do ordain thee this day the high priest of the Jews, and that thou beest called my friend. I have also sent thee as presents a purple robe and a golden crown, and desire that now thou art by us honoured, thou wilt in like manner respect us also. And so in other words, he's saying, I'm going to honour you, but I want you to honour me. And so a relationship's being engineered here. So 3 years later, in 150 BC, Demetrius is defeated in battle by Alexander and loses his life in the process. Let's again read from the Jewish historian Josephus and what he has to say. It reads, But King Alexander raised a great army of mercenary soldiers and of those that deserted to him out of Syria, and made an expedition against Demetrius. And when it came to battle, the left wing of Demetrius put those who opposed him to flight, and pursued them a great way, and slew many of them, and spoiled their camp. But the right wing, where Demetrius happened to be, was beaten. And as for all the rest, they ran away. But Demetrius fought courageously, and slew a great many of the enemy. But as he was in the pursuit of the rest, his horse carried him into a deep bog. It's extraordinary how many times we've been following this history where we find the problem with a horse is the undoing of kings, and this happens again. So it has carried him into a deep bog where it was hard to get out, and there it happened that upon his horse's falling down, he could not escape being killed. For when his enemies saw what had befallen him, they returned back and encompassed Demetrius round, and they all threw their darts at him. But he, being now on foot, fought bravely, but at length he received so many wounds that he was not able to bear up any longer, but fell. And this is the end that Demetrius came to. And so we see the end of yet another Seleucid ruler. So with victory, the illegitimate Alexander takes the throne of a much smaller Seleucid Empire, and it now only consists of Syria and Pergamon. And so on this map, here's Pergamon here, and Syria, well that's today's boundaries, but Syria in those days encompassed this region around here. So they've only got these two things. Remember, the Seleucid Empire was massive before that, and so there's really not much of it left. So his status as a king is honoured by his new allies, the Egyptian co-rulers, Ptolemy and Cleopatra, who give their daughter Cleopatra in marriage, and Jonathan Maccabeus is invited to Ptolemais for the ceremony. So he's now on the guest list, and he gets to actually go and see the marriage of princesses and kings. So Jonathan brings presents for both kings and sits between them as an equal. But whilst Alexander I honours him by giving his own royal garments to wear, it is important to realise that Mathan and the Jews of Judea are still under the rule of the Seleucid Empire. So what this means is that they're given autonomous rule, but they're not actually free altogether. They're not completely independent. So for this reason, before Jonathan leaves Ptolemais, Alexander appoints him strategos and meridarch, which means the civil governor of the province of Judea, and refuses to listen to any further complaints from the Hellenic Jews against Jonathan. So the fact that he's appointed means they're not completely free, but he now has the authority to rule within their territory. And so we see a huge shift from where it was before. It was only the father's generation that was actually being slaughtered by the previous Seleucid ruler. It was the previous Seleucid ruler who put the statue in the temple. There's a previous Seleucid ruler who killed 40,000 of them and enslaved 40,000 of them. And so things have dramatically changed since they stood up and revolted. And part of the message behind all this, of course, is what happened. One rural priest, who was an insignificant person, refused to slaughter a pig. And that's where it all started from. So because one person stood up and stood for God and what God asked him to do, this revolt started, and now we see a generation later that these people are rubbing shoulders, having lunch with the king and being entertained at weddings. And so a big shift. All right, almost finished. So in 147 BC, Demetrius II Nicator, a son of the former king Demetrius, claims the Seleucid throne in a challenge to Alexander, and Apollonius Theos, who governs the sub-province of Syria, uses this conflict to challenge Jonathan of Judea to a battle. So in other words, there's another challenge for the kingship of the Seleucid Empire, and the governor of Syria, so there's Syria at the top, then there's this region down here which is called Syria, there's Phoenicia, and then there's Samaria, and then there's Judea. So they're all sub-provinces of the province of Syria. And so this fellow to the north decides that he's going to have a go at Jonathan whilst the challenge is on for the kingship. So he believes that Jonathan's strength in battle lies in his use of guerrilla tactics, so he challenges him to leave the high terrain to venture out onto the plain at Jaffa. Jonathan and his brother Simon oblige and send out 10,000 men from Jerusalem to the port city on the Mediterranean coast. The men of Apollonius are unprepared for this speedy show of force that arrives at Jaffa, and its citizens fearfully open the city gates and surrender. But this battle is far from over, for Apollonius receives reinforcements of 3,000 men and cavalry from nearby place called Azotus, which is actually the renamed Ashdod. So we see some name changes. Jerusalem is currently known as Antioch. Acco or Accra is changed to Ptolemais. Joppa is changed to Jaffa, and Ashdod is now called Azotus during this particular period of time. So some men come up to engage in the battle, but it's a huge mistake because not only does Jonathan win, but he continues south to assault, capture, and burn Azotus, the resident temple of Dagon, the god of fishing, and all surrounding villages. And so I'm going to put up a couple of images for you to help bring this to life. So here we are. This is a photo we took here in Israel. Where the photo has been taken from is actually the ancient city of Jaffa. And you can see these old walls that are here in the foreground. This is Tel Aviv. And so Tel Aviv is like the Gold Coast, like where we are in Israel. It's very modern. It's a party town. It's a coastal city. People go surfing, beaches, all that sort of thing. It's a very liberal part of Israel. So you won't find Orthodox Jews in these sort of places. But the thing is that these two places are side by side, and in front of the ancient city of Jaffa, there's a promontory that sticks out in the water, and it's got a harbour there. So that was the natural harbour. Jaffa, of course, is the place where what happened in the Bible?
Is it the fish, the boat, where Jesus?
No?
No.
I thought you were onto it. There's a story called Jonah and the fish, right? And the boat. So Jaffa is one of the locations. What else was Jaffa used for? Little memory test, Jaffa cakes. Jaffa was the location where the logs, the cedar logs, were floated down to build the Temple of Jerusalem. And so from the coast here to the city of Jerusalem, it's about 26 kilometres. That's how far it is. It's a very small country. And so this is the place where they were actually brought in. But if you take notice of the structures here, the building and these domed roofs that are actually here, we have an artist's impression which was done a long, long time ago. And you may see the same style of buildings with these domed roofs that are actually here. And so this is an undertaking to represent what the ancient cities would have looked like at the time. So basically, they're towns, they're not very big, and they would have a wall around the outside, and they would have a fortress attached to them full of soldiers, in essence. And so they would trade from this place. It was a trading port. Now, in Ashdod, today, if you try and go there, this is what you get to see. This is all that's actually left. Now, here at this point in time in the story of the Maccabees, it actually says that Jonathan went down there and he destroyed Ashdod. So here it is today. There's nothing left there standing, a bit of rubble. This location, I tried to get there when we were in Israel, only to find it's actually part of a live army base. And so I didn't get very far. I did ask for permission through a guy in the tower in the window, and he looked at me like I was a loony. And we ended up having a bit of a laugh. I said, well, I'm from Australia, so we have no idea, but can I go in? And he's like, but this is the zone right now that's being bombed from Gaza. Okay, they've built a new city a little bit further up. It's called Ashdod still. This is a illustration that I've drawn in colour of the fish god. So this is from a relief, so it's stone reliefs where they're carved in ancient times, and this is how they actually represent the fish god. So the priests in the day, and I always have a bit of a laugh about this because I wonder whether it's actually a real smelly fish on their head or not, or whether it's an adornment, but they would actually wear the fish's head and the back of the body down like this. They would wear these skirts at the back, which would resemble a scales, for example, and they would carry various emblems of office. So this is actually what Dagon, the fish god, actually looks like. Okay, so so I've put a coloured illustration as opposed to a sandstone relief, so you can see how they dressed. So to wrap up, Apollonius, this fellow who acted without the consent of Alexander, decides to give the city of Ekron and its outer territories to Jonathan as a gift. And so I'll just go back to this map. So here's Ekron. Ekron is a former Philistine city, which you read about in the Bible during the time of the Philistines. So what's happening here is that the coastal regions were never controlled by the people, by the Jews. And so suddenly we find that the Jews now have taken Jaffa, they've taken what was called Ashdod, they've now been given Ekron, and they control all of the hill country. So what I'm really saying to you is that at this point in history, they're actually growing their territory back. And obviously, what's their intention? Their intention is to regain all of their former territories, which God had given to them. And so the people of Azotus or Ashdod who are wiped out, they're not happy with Jonathan, obviously, for taking them out. And they take their complaint to the Egyptian king, who's there to make war against his son-in-law, Alexander I. The reason why? Because it's actually his daughter who's married to him, and she's up to no good. In fact, she stands against her own father. Reporting the destruction of Azotus and the temple of Dagon as if it was instigated by Jonathan is a mistake, though, as troops were sent from there to attack the army of the Maccabees. So Jonathan wants peace and is not seeking to fight Egypt's king, so he arranges to meet with him, and after conveying the reason behind his actions, he keeps the peace even though he supports a different contender for the Seleucid throne. So the Egyptians are trying to stop the new contender for the throne coming in. Jonathan is aligned with the other party, and yet they've agreed not to go against each other in battle. And so we draw to a close at this point. So we're sort of halfway through this descendant. As I said, basically what you're going to see happen as we go through the journey with the Maccabees now is the territory of the Jewish people is going to continue to expand. And then we're going to start moving into the time of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the explanation of the Sanhedrin, and so on from this point in time. So